All right, so that's it with page 1. Let's move on to page 2. Okay, so f is defined as this set of points here, and g is defined as this set of points here. Let's look at f of g of negative 2. So f of g of negative 2 is going to be f of 4. And f of 4 is 7, so the answer to this one is 7. I'm going to go ahead and sprint through the rest of these. Hopefully you can keep. All right, folks, there's answers to question 3, part A, B, and C, as well as D. I hope that was pretty straightforward for you. Let's move on to question 4. Question 4, we're asked to write each function as a composition of 3 or more functions. I'm going to start with A here and say that I can do this if I let f of x equal x squared, and that will take care of the x squared, and we say let's let g of x equal to x minus 4. And if you think of this problem as what you would do to evaluate this function, the first thing you would do is square your input. Then you would subtract 4. So that's what g of x equals x minus 4 does. And the last thing you would do is you would take the square root of all of that. So that takes care of those 3 different operations. And this function now, f, is equal to h of g of f of x. And if you were to write that using the other composite function notation, you would say f is h composed with g composed with f of x. And I know that this right here looks like hog off, but it's not. It's h composed with g composed with f. All right, and one question you might have is, did you have to do this with 3? Couldn't you have called f of x x squared minus 4 and then g of x the square root of that? You could have, but the instructions said to write it as a composition of 3 or more. So let's go ahead and take a look at this next one here. And I'm going to sprint through this one for you. Okay, there is the function g of x, which is this, in this case, composition of 4 different functions. That's the way I showed that one, and you might have had a couple different ways you could do that with 3 functions. Let's move on here to question 5, our 5th and final question for this set of notes. We have f of x equals x plus 7, g of x equals x minus 5, h of x equals the opposite of x, j of x equals the absolute value of x, k of x equals j of x is square root of x, k of x absolute value, I is squared, and m is a doubling function. In what order must these functions be composed to create this ginormous function f of x? Well, let's take a look at this. The first thing I must do is square. So that's going to be the first thing I do. Second thing we're going to do is add 7. Third thing we got to take care of is the absolute value symbol. Fourth thing is going to be the doubling, and that takes care of everything under the square root. So the square root will be the 5th function. And really, I'm just thinking through the order of operations here, folks. The squaring is the 5th function. The opposite, that'll be the 6th thing I need to do, and the 5th or the 7th and final thing I need to do is subtract 5. So that's going to be the order. What's that going to look like? Well, let's take a look at this. Big F of x is going to equal, the first thing I did was the squaring. So that takes care of I. And then the second thing I did was add 7. So that's F. Third thing we did was absolute value. So that's K. Fourth thing is, oh, I didn't even list the 4. I think I listed 2 twice here. Hopefully you caught up onto that before I did. So that's the fourth thing we do, which is the doubling function. So that's M. And the fifth thing we did was the square root. That's J. And then the sixth thing we did was take the opposite of everything. So that's H. And last but not least, we took care of the subtracting 5 with G. So, wow, that's kind of tricky. So that ginormous function, capital F, is G composed with H, composed with J, composed with M, composed with K, composed with F, composed with I, and that's the end of this section. Best of luck to you in WebAssign, folks.